So I am Catherine Prescott. I'm the chief curator at Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center. And my lovely co-host is Mary Saltis Automanelli, a board member at the Hendrick I Lot House in Brooklyn, New York. And we are very glad to welcome you to the 5th Taproom Tastings of the season. Yeah, we're almost done with the season. I can't believe it. Tonight we are going to talk all about gin and its fairly complicated history, its rise and fall in popularity. But to begin, because this season we haven't really had many demonstrations or historical recipes, I thought I would share with you a popular gin cocktail from the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. The recipe was sent out to you in the reminder email yesterday with the Zoom link. So hopefully you got it, and I will send it again with the recording tonight. As always, please leave any questions you have in the chat. We like to keep this pretty informal, pretty casual, so you don't have to wait until the end. Whenever you've got a question or a curiosity, just put it in the chat and we'll try and address it, and we'll kind of let the conversation flow that way a little bit. So tonight we're going to begin with a gin daisy. So the daisy was a cocktail that was developed in the 1870s. It was like a whiskey, orange cordial, and soda water drink cocktail that was popular in the bars along Wall Street. So it's very popular with stock traders for a bit. But then about 20 years later, it became really popular with the dudes who were kind of these young men of leisure. They were supposedly very fashionable. They were kind of described as dandies. And they liked to enjoy this cocktail at their Westchester country clubs while they were golfing. And it used gin instead of whiskey, and then raspberry syrup or grenadine, which gave it like a flashy pink color, which was very popular among the dudes. To start, I have some lemon and lime juice that I've mixed with sugar to dissolve. And to that, I'm going to add some grenadine, which is basically just a pomegranate flavored syrup, simple syrup. So I'll add a little bit there. And then to that, I will add my gin, which I measured out in advance.
I was gonna say, did this have actual recipe quantities, or it was just, does it say dash of little of this, pour in that to your heart's desire?
This recipe actually did have actual quantities. So by the turn of the 20th century, there were actual recipes. The profession of mixology was actually well established by now. So there were lots of those. So before I add the seltzer, I am going to put some ice in here as I drop it all over the floor. And then lastly, I'll put a little bit of seltzer to give some fizz. And to finish, I'll garnish with a little mint. So that is your gin daisy. So as I said, gin daisies were very popular, first among the Wall Street set and then among the golf set. And it came up to a little bit of difficulty with Prohibition when they were not allowed to be drinking gin. But this drink was actually sort of preserved, if you will, at the Agua Caliente Golf Resort in Tijuana, Mexico. Where a lot of these dandies would go to play golf and to drink their daisies. Now, if you speak a Romance language, you might see where this is going. But in Mexico, if you're ordering in Spanish and you're ordering a drink that replaces gin for the local liquor, tequila, you have some lime juice, some orange liqueur and maybe a splash of soda, when you're ordering it in Spanish, you're going to ask for a margarita. So that is actually, the gin daisy is a precursor to the margarita, the very popular margarita, which I thought is kind of a fun little tidbit. So I hope you enjoy your cocktail with us as we talk about the history of gin.
I did really love all of the different recipes and the cocktail recipes that I found, because you can see that rise of mixology becoming into an actual profession, and you see it a lot. I pulled up a Prohibition era cocktail book, which I thought was very funny. You can see this like professionalism kind of morph into no, this is a real thing. Bartenders know what they're doing. You can't just take shots of things anymore. It has to taste good. It's going to be delicious. Trust me. I want to share. We do this all the time, and every so often I always forget how it works. So this is how to mix drinks. So this is the very first printed like official cocktail book. The gin cocktail is very simple. I just love that the one underneath it said fancy gin cocktail, and it was basically just like put it in a nicer glass. But they all seemed very simple, and I think even the gin punch is kind of similar to what you just made. So there's a lot of similar, but like they would put very small variations of it and call it a completely different thing. But it's always just like, here's a lot of gin. What other extras can I add to make it sweet? So I did like this one. Jerry Thomas was like that first professional, made it famous as a bartender kind of a person, and he published his book. And then we sneak just a bit to Prohibition. I loved the names of all of the cocktails in this book. They made me laugh when I was going through it. So everything but the kitchen sink, Royal Smile, and they all came with like little catchphrases. So like Royal Smile, which after 2 or 3 brings a royal flush, of course, on your face. And then Alexander's Sister. Like Alexander, this little drink will give you the ambition to conquer more world. And they're all very simple, right? So we've spoken about Applejack. We're going to speak about gin today. It's lemon juice, orange juice, a lot of creams. I wasn't expecting. The Everything But has an egg in it, and then the Alexander Sister has cream in it, which I guess is something that you want to do because you're trying to stand out in the concept of making drinks. I prefer the one that you made. I just like it, just sweet, simple, to the point, maybe a royal style. But it was very interesting seeing the level of gin to like a lemon juice, a lime juice, anything else that was mixed in with like 1/3 part gin, 2/3 part Applejack, and then just like a splash of grenadine to make it sweet enough. But it was nice to see kind of quantities on the recipes, because before this, it was just kind of like drink to your heart's desire. We're not putting a garnish on anything that you're making. And then you can kind of go into the fact that you see these like fancy drinks now, and you get them with like little umbrellas, and they come in shapes and stuff. I don't know. It's very interesting to watch the rise of like drinking in the United States.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've found in researching gin was that a lot of the history of gin is the history of cocktails as well. And really, once gin kind of finally sheds its like really terrible reputation that it earned in the 18th and 19th centuries, it's really all about the cocktail. Maybe we'll have to do like a cocktail episode once.
Oh my goodness.
But one of the things about gin, I think if we kind of go back to the beginning, is of the classic liquors and spirits, gin is the youngest. Gin was as far as I could tell, like a drink that was recognizable as gin wasn't developed until the 14th century, 15th century. Around there, the date is a little bit sketchy, but yeah, so it's a pretty young spirit actually. And so gin, what we know as gin today, developed in the Netherlands as the distilled beverage called Genever. And in the Netherlands and Belgium, they still make Genever today in the same kind of tradition. So there is a slight difference between Genever or Holland gin and most of the gin that we find in America today, which is a London dry gin. It's an English style. But Genever began as a distilled malt wine that was flavored with juniper and other botanicals. And as time went on, as it kind of evolved a little bit, and also as wine production in Europe kind of decreased due to climate changes in the climate and war and other things, they started switching to distilling grain alcohol, so rye, barley, and flavoring that with juniper and botanicals. And that's what kind of developed into the English tradition of gin. And the name as well kind of shifted along with that. So from Genever, the English then pronounced it Ginever and then shortened it to gin.
So close.
Yeah. But the English have a tendency to do that. You take the old name and, you know, mix it up and pretend it's your own.
Oh yeah. It is interesting. I think when we were looking into it, the origins of it were kind of, I mean, they're all usually wrapped in this concept of being medicinally good for you. And it's always starting off with like, oh, no, the medicinal purposes of this are really good for you. Unlike most spirits that we've looked into, the juniper seed, and then when it was fermented into Genever, is like this big cure-all. It was like any kind of ailment that you had in your insides. It was like good for your gut. It was good for your lungs. It was good for a cold. And I was able to find like the health benefits go back into ancient times. I had to write some of these down because I was like kind of taken aback by it. So I have ancient Egyptians boiled juniper with frankincense, cumin, and goose fat as a treatment for headaches. The Arabs extracted the juniper and used it for toothache pain. They extracted the resin from it when they boiled it to make like a toothache treatment. And then in medieval times, it was a concoction of rosemary, sage, juniper, and a bunch of other herbs that would be used as contraceptives, which I thought was very interesting. Of course, I can't find any like recipes for it because that would be too easy. And I'm asking for a lot of like, what did you, we go back to that cookbook episode where it's like you're expected to know so much before you have to actually read the cookbook for the rest of the instructions. So it was interesting to see how far back the juniper concept goes. And then I know it was used a lot with midwives because they would give it to women who were actively induced in labor because it would calm them down because it's liquor. But they would also use it after the baby came out to like clean the baby up to get the baby gunk off, or there was a specific term that I don't remember offhand, but it was like used to clean the baby's eyes and wipe it down and give it as like a first bath situation as well. So that was not where I was expecting like the like medicinal remedies of juniper and gin to come from. It was a fun wild ride to go on that research to like look into medieval times, because even during the Black Plague, the juniper was also part of the plague masks that they would use when they would go into all of the sick people's areas, homes, hospitals, wherever they were. And they would burn those remedies in front of the houses too, because my medieval medical background is not as strong as I would like it to be. They were burning these scent packets in front of their house because they didn't understand germ theory and they thought it was spread through the air. So they would burn all of the herbs in order to stop it from coming into their house, like to stop the plague from coming into their living quarters, from what I can understand. I had to read it a few times. My specialty is like 18th century. Okay. Anything past like 1850, I'm out, quite frankly, sometimes. So I tried.
Yeah.
Yeah, miasma. That's what I was thinking of. That's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not my thing.
Yeah, I did read a lot about the juniper being used against the plague, and that kind of helped spread its popularity in or the popularity of gin in England once it kind of made its way over, because there had been an outbreak of plague shortly before that. And so I think one of the things I found is I kind of looked into why the Netherlands, why the Netherlands of all places to be the center of this, you know, the center of gin and where it developed. And it was really interesting because it's mostly about geography. It's the Netherlands, and Rotterdam specifically was kind of this center point for all of the grain that was being produced and grown in the Baltic states in Central Europe, and it was going to Rotterdam, and they were trading out of there. And so then they were like, well, there's all of this stuff, let's turn it into alcohol because it's easier to store, it's easier to ship, you know,
And
it keeps forever, basically. And so that's what they used. And then it also was, and this gets into one of my favorite topics, imperialism. Because at the same time, the Netherlands was developing into a naval powerhouse, and a mercantile powerhouse. So the Dutch East India Company was also growing, had been set up by this time, and they were coming back to the Netherlands with all of these exotic spices and exotic herbs and flavors that were then being used in the gin to create these different flavors and to create this unique liquor. And so a lot of the first, a lot of the big names in Geneva and in Holland gin that are still around, so things like Bowles and De Kuypers, they were set up at this time, and they had like very close ties to the Dutch East India Company, so they would get first dibs on anything, any of the spices, anything that came in to the Netherlands for their Geneva. And just the success of the Dutch East India Company allowed the Netherlands to just grow and have this golden age, that when Charles II actually fled England, or Charles I, excuse me, he actually stayed in Holland, in The Hague for a bit, and he saw this like really prosperous nation. And so when his son comes back to England, Charles II, he's like, we're gonna be like the Dutch, because they're like super wealthy and they're also drunk all the time. So that's what we're gonna do. Because apparently he like, you know, conflated the two or whatever. And so sort of along those lines, Charles II's court was very known for excess. And a lot of that, historians think, come a little bit from his experiences and his father's experiences in the Netherlands as well. But I didn't realize how enormous the Dutch East India Company was. They had like hundreds of ships. They had like 50,000 people, sailors. It was enormous. It was like a nation of its own. It was crazy. But that gin really, I think more than just about any other alcohol, except maybe rum, is so closely tied. Its success is so closely tied to empire building and imperialism. And it mostly starts with the Dutch, because it was those sailors who were bringing it to the world. But then, so we have Geneva, but then it does end up in England, who kind of takes over, and takes over kind of gin manufacture. And one of the things I found interesting is I'd known about the gin craze of the 19th century, right? But I hadn't, and maybe I guess I like combined the two, but there had been a gin craze in England, London mostly, in the 18th century. So gin really takes off in England when, in around 1688, when William and Mary ascend to the throne, because William the Third was William of Orange. He was also the ruler of the Dutch people of Orange. And so he kind of brings Geneva to England and really allows it to gain popularity. It was this new drink that's associated with the new Protestant regime, as opposed to the French Catholics, brandy and things like that. William was also at war with the French, and so he put a high tax on French brandy, so people couldn't really access that anymore. And so in the like 15 years after he comes to the throne, consumption of gin nearly doubles from 500,000 gallons to over 1 million gallons in 1700, which is an insane amount of gin.
It keeps going up. I found those statistics too.
Yeah.
Like it's larger than other statistics for other liquors that we've covered.
Yeah.
And this is just England.
Yeah. And it's, I
Yeah.
think also the period of time is astounding, like just how fast it rises. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that gin is actually pretty easy to make yourself. And there was legislation that allowed anyone pretty much to begin distilling gin. William and then Queen Anne after that kind of removed a lot of the restrictions, removed the control that the guilds had over distilling. And so basically all you needed to start selling gin to people was you need to purchase an inexpensive license. I think it was maybe like 10 shillings. So it's not like super cheap, but it was pretty affordable for most people. And then you had to give 10 days notice to the excise man, the tax man, to say, hey, 10 days from now, I'm going to start making gin and selling it. And that was it. And anybody could do it. And so you have all of these distilleries, these like little tiny distilleries popping up. And gin becomes so inexpensive. It's cheaper than beer, cheaper than any other alcohol. And so people just start consuming it. And then it starts to become
a bad thing. Yeah, then it becomes a bad thing.
Yeah.
You know what? I have something, but of course it takes me longer than usual. Nope, that's not it. It's my screen. It never gets easier. There it is. Ha ha ha. So to add to what Catherine was saying, gin starts becoming very bad for public consumption. From what I can understand from the propaganda that I've read and seen, it was if everybody, women, children, animals included, were drinking gin to the point where everybody was just so drunk that they could not function and society was about to like seize as it was at that exact time. Gin Lane up here on the screen was something that came out by the 1750s. You can see it a little bit closer. It culminated into the Gin Act of 1751, which reduced the amount of places that were able to legally sell gin. So instead of giving that 10 days notice, it was just a handful of places. I found one description from 1714. Nothing is more destructive either in regard to the health or the vigilance and industry of the poor than the infamous liquor, the name of which derived from the juniper berries in Dutch, is now by frequent use in the Atlantic spirit of the nation, from a word of middling length shrunk into a monosyllable, intoxicating gin that charms the unactive, the desperate, the crazy of either sex. It is a fiery lake that sets the brain in flame, burns up the entrails, and scorches every part within, and at that same time, a length of oblivion in which the wretch immersed drowns his most pinching cares. So gin, because of its popularity, ruins lower class British culture. There's the description for this was really in depth because it was like if you look at every single part of this illustration, there's something to look at. So that the woman in the center is so consumed by gin that she's letting her small child fall off the side of the staircase. The dogs are sad. The bottom left hand, the dog and a man are sharing a bone to eat. There's a lot going on. But really, like we had mentioned in 1700, about 1.23 million gallons were ingested. By 1751, I found a statistic that was 7 million gallons were ingested. That's a lot. Especially when we're talking about like England, beer consumption for the same period remained relatively consistent at only 3 million gallons a year. That's a lot. I was really astounded by this because we've done liquor talks in the past, and I was looking up those statistics as well. And I always expect them to be within like a million, like one off, maybe two off. But these were so astronomically on different ends that it was kind of like I almost didn't believe it for a second because it was just so prominent. But then you see things like this in the illustrations that were going on and the propaganda that was going on, and the fact that the Gin Act had to be created for England at that time, that you're like, okay, maybe it was true. Maybe this was a thing. But I always look back at like the the whiskey one that we did, and I always thought that was the highest one, and it's not. So, and then I went looking into like how much gin do we drink in the United States? Shout out to New York for being the highest state to drink gin. Connecticut was like at a normal level, and New York City was the highest. I think it has something to do with all the fancy, like weird cocktail places that we have in the city. But I was like, it still doesn't even come close to those numbers. I mean, like gin peaked in the 1750s.
Yeah.
It had its moment.
And don't quote me on this. But I seem to remember around that time, the population of London was like 8 million people or something like that. Or close to that. So that's like, yeah. And
She
they're
always, it
drinking
makes it
7
feel wrong.
million gallons a year. Yeah. That's quite, yeah. And I think a lot of it was, you know, gin was so inexpensive. And it had been purposely made that way, you know, made to be inexpensive. And then that just like cycled. One of the things I did find, which were kind of interesting, I like this. So there were a series of gin acts kind of in throughout the first part of the 1700s to try and get a handle on this like out of control gin consumption. And after one of them, so in the second Gin Act in 1736, one of the things that they put in was like incentives for snitching on people who were distilling or selling gin without a license. And so it led to a lot of like people turning on their neighbors and the police like really kind of abusing their power a little bit. But there was this one guy, Captain Dudley Bradstreet, who had been a spy in you know the army, and he was a former soldier. He I guess, realized that the police didn't have the authority to enter a building um, to catch somebody selling gin, and they had to like catch the person in the act of selling gin. And so he created this really clever, I think, uh, way, kind of a hack to get around the Gin Act. It's called the Puss and Mew machine, also called Bradstreet's cat. And basically what it is he bought this little house and had this cat put into the wall, like a little window, fill a window. And people would go up to it and they would ask the cat statue, they would say, "Puss, do you have any gin?" Then the cat would meow and a little drawer in its mouth would open up and you put your money in and then it would close. And then Bradstreet behind this cat would pour gin and it would come out the spout in its paw. And
Incredible.
so at the same time, there was a new kind of style of gin that was being made that was sweeter, less sweet than Geneva, but more sweet than what would become London Dry Gin. And so it became known as Old Tom because it would be delivered to you by this tomcat. So I believe there are still some distilleries that are making Old Tom gin, or that style of gin today. But yeah, so the Puss and Mew was really funny. You know, people come up with all sorts of clever things when they're stopped from doing something.
I was gonna say, it reminds me of the prohibition stuff that I was looking into, of like how to serve in while it was illegal,
Yeah. And one of
and
the
like
other
bathtub
things,
gin.
yeah, and I think one of the other things, speaking of like the Old Tom gin and the bathtub gin, um, at this time, and I think this is one of the problems as well, there was no sort of quality control, no regulations on what could be considered gin. And so people were just using all sorts of stuff to mimic the juniper flavor, because to use the juniper berries, you have to dry it, you have to let it age for like several years, you have to, do the whole distilling and, steeping process. And so they would use all sorts of things. Often it was turpentine, which is just like a pine oil extract, and like sulfuric acid. And so they would add sugar to those to mask so that's how you get Old Tom gin, which is slightly kind of the sweeter types of gin. But the other
Probably
thing is
not worth it.
one of the big fears was how many women were starting to drink gin, because that before this it was like really frowned upon for women to be visibly drinking alcohol liquors. But because these gins were sweet, they were more like sweet cordials. And so a lot more women. And I think that's where all the reformers kind of landed on, as this is how we can kind of crack down on gin, as we talk about how it's ruining our women.
Yeah, that connection continues to prohibition around the time of women getting to vote, and this concept of femininity. Um, it was interesting to watch like the temperance movement continue into that. Like women are going into these speakeasies on like dates, and this concept of like dating and courting or shifting, and like where you're going, and you're all doing this illegal act together in like a speakeasy in the corner in the dark and stuff. So they would drink. And it was about women kind of reclaiming these spaces and kind of making that new woman, that flapper woman that we know today from the 1920s and the 1930s. And it was interesting to read about, because it was kind of like women were not supposed to be drinking out loud, right, in public. You're not supposed to be visibly drunk. It was supposed to be, you don't go to taverns. And it was, prohibition kind of took all those rules away. And it was like, well, I want to go to the illegal places too. And I want to go hang out with people and all that other fun stuff that they got to do, which was great. But it was interesting to see also how you were talking about the additives. Gin was one of the most easily produced liquors during Prohibition because it didn't need any extra like additives to make it darker, like the whiskey would have or the rum. Um, Most bootleggers would start adding weird, um, if I may, toxic or poisonous additives to the whiskey, to the rum to make it darker because they wouldn't let it ferment long enough in the process. Whereas gin was a clear liquor, so they were just like, it's fine, it'll be okay. You don't need to add that many things. It was easier to produce, easier to ship, and easier to just kind of move around as they would distill it, which was interesting because I that's something I had never thought of before. So gin has its moment again in Prohibition, and it was interesting to see all of the cocktails in that book. How heavily based they were in gin, like most of it was like gin based or had a smidge of gin in it. And I am a gin and tonic fan, but I was like, it's just all right, it's having its moment. It's great. But yeah, it was interesting when I was reading the additives for gin when the in the time period that you were talking about and how it kind of just kind of tips a little during Prohibition. I was like, that fun part of history
Yeah.
that you're like, you know, it tasted weird, and you were just like, we're gonna go with it.
Yeah.
I love the
And I
FDA.
think Prohibition, like the late 1800s, early 1900s, and Prohibition is really when gin kind of takes off in America, because before that, it's not really a thing, which surprised me because one of the reasons I had suggested to Mary that we do gin is because it shows up in Timothy Keeler's ledgers, which I always like to go to. So I did try and find some information about gin consumption in colonial America, and there is like nothing. There's some talk, in Long Island, Staten Island, New Amsterdam, New Netherlands, where the Dutch are. There's a little bit of a tradition of Geneva, but I don't think there is a species of juniper that is native to the United States, but it's not one that makes for good flavored gin, I believe. So any juniper that they're using does need to come be imported. And I did find a couple of names for like domestic distilleries. There's one in Vermont, and one in Georgia. Henry Snow was a distiller that made Georgia Geneva from 1767 in Savannah. And then a couple of other kind of mentions of distilleries that were making Geneva-like liquors in the New York area. But as I said, we know gin was being consumed here in Ridgefield because Timothy was selling it to people. So I did go through some of the ledgers that we are lucky to have. I actually first went to the bills of sale. So the things, these are records of what Timothy is buying in New York City to bring up to Ridgefield to then sell in his store or in his tavern. And you can see, so these are 1789, 1790, and then 1791. He buys several cases of Geneva. And
That's a large amount.
it is a large amount. It's fairly expensive. He's spending £3 on 2 cases of Geneva. So I'm not, he's spending quite a bit. And then I went to the ledgers to see if that's being resold, out. He's obviously buying it in, so has to sell it. And you can see here's in 1791, you have a gentleman on 2 occasions in January and February buying rum and gin together, which is interesting. And then here's another 1790. A pint of gin went for 1 shilling, which is
So he is theoretically using it in the bar because it doesn't seem like he's reselling the stuff that he's buying.
he's definitely buying it or selling it in kind of tavern quantities as opposed to wholesale,
Yeah.
big, wholesale quantities. Um, Unlike the rum, which is going for like gallons, right?
Yeah.
Gin, you find it's a half pint here, a pint there. Um, and one of the things, because I've always known gin as a cocktail beverage. You don't drink gin neat for the most part. Um, but before the 1820s, 1830s, that's how you drank gin, was just straight. Geneva is still drunk in a shot. Holland gin is drank in a shot. One of the things I did find is in the Netherlands, they like to use Geneva as a chaser for beer. Um, and so you drink your beer and then chase it
Ooh.
with a shot of Geneva, and it's called a what's it? It's called a kopstoot, which means a headbutt. um,
That is perfect. Yeah.
yeah, so gin had been
Interesting.
drunk straight for a long time, but it does very quickly become the cocktail beverage. It's the good liquor to use in a mixed drink. And I found early references to that in the ledgers, because Timothy is selling gin slings. And a sling is like a single serving punch. So you have your alcohol, either brandy, whiskey, rum, or gin, sugar, water, a little nutmeg, some citrus. And then later on, you would add bitters of some kind. But in the 18th century, you have the sling, and you can see, so Thomas Scott in 1800 has a gin sling, and then he gets a glass of gin after that. But he also gets brandy slings, and I guess he was a frequent tavern guest, because he's coming frequently and he gets brandy slings quite often. But this is one of the few references I've found to like mixed proto cocktails, I guess you would call them, at the tavern. So that was really exciting to find he had the gin sling here.
Wonder if he was getting that gin as a way to update the menu to see if it was worth importing and just kind of trying it out to see if the tavern goers would be interested in trying something different.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like, well, it's 3 years in a row, or at least two in like a couple of months. He's getting gin from New York. So somebody must be consuming it to make it worth it.
Mhm.
So that was interesting. So 18th century, we do have Americans drinking gin, even if it might just be in Ridgefield. Um, but it really isn't until the middle, 1830s, 1840s that gin really takes off. And
Yeah.
partly this is kind of at the tail end of the second gin craze in Britain, which came about with the Industrial Revolution and the development of the continuous still, which allowed for a much tighter control of quality. And it made it cheaper and easier to produce large quantities of gin. And it's at this time you get the London dry gin, because the
Mhm.
continuous still makes it easier to make a pure alcohol. You don't need all of the sweeteners and the other flavorings to like mask the roughness of the gin. So you get the London dry gin, which turns out it's clear, it's aromatic, and it actually is enhanced when you mix it with ice. And so that's like three really good qualities for adding to a cocktail. And so I think that's how gin kind of becomes the cocktail liquor for up and through Prohibition.
That was easier. Yeah, I was really I loved I'm gonna pull up again. I forgot that Rip Van Winkle drinks Holland gin to put himself to sleep for 20 years. So it came up, I was reading something and I said, oh yeah, he's Dutch because it's upstate New York. This makes sense. So I pulled up a little passage of, he was thirsty and wanted a drink. I'll risk it. He thought it can be no sin, and it smells like the best of Holland gin. So he tipped his cup to a grim old chap and drained it, then for a quiet nap. I love Rip Van Winkle, so I was excited to be able to like use that as a reference for this lecture. I don't know why I hadn't made that connection. This was like I was deep into research, and I went, oh yeah, he had gin, because I was looking into the Dutch in New York and New Amsterdam and that early reference of what was going on in colonial New York at the time. And I was like, oh yeah, he fell asleep because he had Holland gin. Because we were talking about the difference between the British gin and the Holland gin and what the differences were with the notes and the production and stuff. And I was like, it would make sense that he would have Holland gin. But yeah, I was looking into colonial distilleries, and I would get the same, like they were making rum or they were making applejack or like byproducts of the main stuff. And nobody was specifically making gin for a really long time. I did find one reference to the Pierponts when he bought most of Clover Hill, which is now Brooklyn Heights, because there was a distillery on Joralemon, which faces the East River, which is a very quick ride over the East River to New York City with Robert Fulton's steamships. But it really does skip. I don't know if you found that reference as well when you were looking into your research. It really is like very concentrated into like a European history, and it kind of just grazes over the 18th and kind of 19th century in the United States. And then it's like prohibition. Everybody was drinking. Isn't it great? And then it goes into more 20th century, like how people are opening up distilleries now, and you get like the cocktails and the fancy distilleries where they're using all their fancy botanicals, and they've got like weird stories of their origin, of how they got involved in this. And I was like, where, like there's got to be like a meat to this history. And I think this is one of the first lectures when we were doing the research that the both of us were like, are we missing? We were typing in different words. I was like, I moved into Geneva from gin, and I was looking at different search words, and it's interesting to see it go up and down in popularity at different times. I don't know. It was very strange. I mean,
one of the things I was thinking as I was reading, because when you're reading about gin production in the 17th century in England, they often talk about distilling corn. And from our wheat talk, I remember that corn was the word that is used in Europe to just mean like any cereal grain for a long time before maize really came from the Americas. And I know gin is usually made from rye or barley or wheat even, and not like actual corn. And so then as I was reading and like trying to figure out why, colonial Americans were not drinking gin or why there's nothing about it, I was thinking, early America was much more maize oriented, right? We were using a lot of cornmeal, a lot of that grain, wheat, barley, rye was like not that big. Like we were growing it. And so I wonder if that was just, we had, corn whiskey, we had,
yeah, that was just the byproduct.
And we had access to all this molasses to make rum. And so all of our grains are just tied up in bread and flour and food and stuff like that. And so there really was no reason to make gin, waste it to make gin, waste it, I guess. When we had such easy access to maize and molasses. But I guess, I mean, I think small scale, people were making gin. Like we said, it's easy to make. So if you have the things, and today to be a gin, it has to have juniper as one of the botanicals, but I have a feeling in the 18th century, they were probably a little less strict about it. It was kind of grain, distilled grain liquor with botanicals. They
I
probably called
definitely
it.
saw some, yeah, I definitely saw some weird ones. I saw an asparagus gin, and somebody was able to find the recipe, but they used juniper, but they also fermented the asparagus with it. It wasn't a company that lasted very long from what I can understand, because I was intrigued, but it seemed like people were experimenting more with gin recipes than they were with a rum or whiskey, because that was just kind of set in its way at that time, especially in American culture, like you were saying. But they took a lot of artistic licensing with seeing what they could put into these concoctions, because they were wondering probably what notes tasted better with what florals or botanicals they were putting in. I have not tried asparagus gin. I wonder if anybody has tried any interesting flavors of gin. I like to stick to the regular botanical flavors. Anything fruity is always really nice. But I've never tried a gin that is infused with some sort of vegetable. I'm not against trying it. It just wouldn't be my first go if I was going to a restaurant and paying like $16 for a cup. I digress though. Yeah, no, I saw a lot of strange recipes when they were coming along with like bathtub gin, because it was the time to experiment with it. I mean, it makes for a great bit today, but I can't imagine somebody seriously looking you in the face being like, I'm going to make carrot gin. It's going to be great.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that was the thing, is gin is just like very flexible and adaptable in
Mm-hmm.
that way. Um, yeah, so we've got a little over 5 minutes left in the hour. So if anyone has any questions or things they're wondering about gin, put it in the chat and we'll try and answer those as well. I did want to talk about, because one of the, when we research these, we always like find these little side tracks and that are
Go for it.
more or less tangentially related. This is pretty related to gin, actually. But it was a connection of gin and interior design, and why pubs and bars kind of look the way they do now. Especially like the traditional English pub, which I thought was really interesting. And it's all to do with the second gin craze of the 19th century. Because as gin regained popularity in the early 1800s, it was sold mostly in what's called a gin palace, which was just like a gin shop or a dram shop, that they would call it. And it wasn't, most taverns and traditional pubs at the time wouldn't serve gin. They were still, ales and whiskey and brandy, like the traditional. And so to kind of entice people, especially the kind of the working class who could now afford gin. Gin was really cheap again. These gin palaces started to utilize kind of the themes of marketing that these new department stores were utilizing, window dressing and things like that. So these palaces were modeled after fashionable shops, and they had this brand new technology of gas lighting. So they would be really bright, and compared to all these kind of dim and shuttered stores, they would have these huge windows, patterned wallpaper, heavy curtains, ornate molding. They would kind of make it really enticing for people to come in to the gin shop, or the gin palace as it was called. And then they would have no tables or chairs, because a traditional tavern is where you come, you want to sit, you relax, and you're interacting with other people, and you're kind of nursing your beer or your whiskey or whatever. But in the gin palace, it's just a long, often mahogany bar that looks like a store counter, a shop counter. And you would lean against it, and you drink your gin as a shot real quick, and get another one, or leave and somebody else would come take your place. And so they're turning over people all the time. But the popularity of the gin palaces meant that the taverns and pubs had to redecorate or they would go out of business. And so now you have like, so this is the Viaduct Tavern in Holborn in London, which was an old gin palace, but this is like, you go to a lot of the pubs in England and it looks kind of like this. And so you can see it's like really ornate, the big windows, lots of light. Obviously this has been modernized a little bit, but you have the long bar as well. So I thought that was interesting, is that gin kind of is the reason why pubs look the way they do now.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Wow. Fancy. Yeah, I'm still taken aback by the fact that gin is being used as a chaser. Yeah, that
Yeah,
one.
I think that's something I'd be interested in trying. I've never tried Genever. It's supposed to be a lot sweeter. It's still kind of a malt wine, so it's like grapes and grain, which is interesting. So yeah, it's a lot sweeter. It's darker in color. So that I would be interested in trying that, just seeing how it differs.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah.
All
Let's see.
right,
Questions.
so
I'm like, we made everybody speechless tonight.
yeah, this was interesting, and there's a lot. I think once you get into like the 20th century, and gin and cocktails and things like that, we didn't even talk about gin and tonics. That's a whole thing. So maybe
Its own lecture.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe we'll do like a cocktail lecture next season or something like that, where we can talk about more about gin. So I think in the last minute, I figured there are tons of nicknames for gin, and I thought I'd read a couple that are my favorites. Some are, nicer than others. There's things like scorch gut and kill me quick or knock me down. I think a lot of these come from the 18th century when gin was mostly turpentine. But then there's also things like Lady's Delight, or Flash of Lightning. That was a nice one. Mother's Ruin, that goes back to, a lot of women ending up drinking gin. And then Dutch Courage, that's also another one. That's British soldiers kind of were one of the first people to bring gin from the Netherlands, and they experienced it when they were at war in the Netherlands. And so drinking a bit of Dutch Courage gave them the courage to fight their wars, their battles. All right, so thank you for joining us. I hope you learned something about gin, and I hope that you get a chance maybe to try a gin daisy, and let us know what you think of that cocktail. And I hope you will join us next month for the last taproom tasting of the season. So it's May 14th, and we will talk about food innovations. So kind of all the different inventions related to food, and things like food packaging and marketing and stuff like that. I'm excited to look into all that. That's going to be
good. It's going to be great.
I hope you'll join us for that. And as always, I will send the recording for this program out to everyone. It will be on our YouTube page. And I hope that you all have a great evening.